Okay, so this is the last day of our full stack. I guess it's full stack revised. I always read it as full stack revisited, but full stack revised week where we're just putting everything together. Today, this is what our README looks like. It's very bare bones, but fret not, I will still teach a full lecture on this because we are going to be containerizing our application and we're going to be doing a Docker Compose with all elements in our applications. So we're going to be doing our Django REST framework backend with our Postgres database, and then we're going to have our React front end. We're going to learn how to make a Docker Compose that works with all components. Um, I did pull up, so if you need a refresher on the Docker Compose we learned before in our Django module, week 15, day 4, so it was the very last day of Django, we had this Dockerized Django API to our AWS. So this is when we first learned about Docker Compose. Typically, we'd just been working from Docker files to do things, like our database was a Docker file for the longest time. And then once we learned Django, we put our Django REST framework together with our database. And so that's where we started learning about Docker Compose. So we had this Docker Compose file that we made where we had our API, which is our backend, and then our Postgres database. So this is kind of a refresher on how we did our Docker Compose with Django in the database and how we used Gunicorn to handle the backend requests and sort of to kind of discuss with the database and get the data. We also learned at that time about Nginx. We didn't do a deep dive into it because we hadn't really revisited our front end portion, but we learned that Gunicorn, which is the server we use for our Django REST framework, doesn't really do well handling requests directly from our front end. Instead, we need the web server component to get those requests from our front end or browser, Postman, whatever, and then hand it off to the backend server, which then looks at our Django REST framework application and Postgres. So at that point, we did create a separate Docker file. So we had our Docker Compose for this whole second half, which was our Django REST framework database portion of our application. And then we made a Docker file called web server. And this one made it so we can receive requests from a front end system, be it or client, be it the browser or Postman, and handle it appropriately. So we had in that Docker file, we start with Nginx as our base image. And then we copied over this configuration file that tells Nginx how we want things set up and where we want it. So we tell it where the API is going to live. We also tell it where we're going to listen to and then how we're going to pass it off to our API. So that's what this file does, this configuration file. And Nginx expects you to have a configuration file copied to this location. And it told us that in documentation, but we made it easy for y'all and just said, this is what it expects. This is how it is. Copy what we do. So then we expanded our Docker Compose file to have everything all in one. So we had our API still, which depended on the database. And then we had our little Nginx server here as well. There's a couple more things. This is kind of just revisiting how we were able to kind of make our backend and leave open a connection to receive requests from Postman and our browser. But we did not deal with our static front-end files here, right? This Nginx is literally just listening on port 80 and passing off requests to our API. So we didn't have anything taking in like a HTML, JavaScript, CSS file, and handling all the front end. This is just purely the middleman and the back end for our Docker Compose. Let's see, we did, after React, we did this last week, right? We learned how to Dockerize our React application by itself. We learned how to do npm run build, which creates that directory that has static files in it, that has those JavaScript, HTML, or the HTML, JavaScript, CSS files. It has those in that directory. And again, we just told you our Docker or our Nginx image that we're using for this Docker file expects those 3 static files to be copied to this location in order to handle our front end using this Nginx web server. So we basically learned both of the components we're going to be putting together today, just at separate times. We learned in our Django portion that Nginx expects this kind of default configuration to handle requests, and Nginx also expects static files to be copied into this location. So today we're going to be combining those two into our Docker image. We're basically going to be doing the same from this, or into our Docker file, sorry. We're going to use our Nginx image. We're going to copy our build into the right location, our React build. And then we're also going to copy a configuration file into the correct location. Super easy. But we're going to take a look at, so when you're in this app, or README for today, we have this Wines Docker Compose app. And y'all have seen this before in other lessons. I'm not sure if you've seen the, the branch that we're using today. This says main, but it's technically a different branch, I think. I forgot how we copied over our repos. I'm pretty sure if you had, I think when we go back, it was a different URL. We're looking at like with auth compose branch before. So now this is a full Docker Compose app. So we're going to be working with this and taking a look at how we do our web server Docker file and default now that we have a React app that we're including in here in the front end. But we're also going to take a look at all these scripts that are written to kind of help you put together this application in an easy way. So we see we have quite a few different scripts, and I've already copied this down, forked it locally, so y'all can too if you want. But we kind of, the goal of this when we first made this is to have kind of a plug and play framework for y'all. And we'll take a look at that when we open up the application. The README is very helpful in what this does and how to get it to run and build your images. So we'll basically be stepping through the README as we're looking at what we've done here for our Docker images or Docker files and our Docker Compose. All right, so I have the application here that I've forked down. Mine, I called it 2 because I already had one from the last cohort, and now we're doing it again. So when we take a look at this, we have in our backend, this looks very familiar, right? This should be what your Django REST framework backend looks like, albeit you probably have a different name for your Django project and then a different application name as well. But we can see everything's here that we're used to. We have our settings.py file that has all of the information in here. It's going to look a bit different, and we're going to talk about why in a second. But it has all of our settings set up. We have our URLs, which these URL patterns have our admin site, but then it also has this API / which includes all of the URLs from our project or our app. So these ones have our individual routes for our API. So this backend contains our whole Django REST framework application. And we can see that it also has a Docker file, and it looks very familiar to what we've done in the past, where we use Python as our base image because we're working in Django, which of course is Python framework, and we target our work directory as source. We copy our requirements.txt in there. We install those requirements. Then we copy everything into the Python image, and then we do this Gunicorn command to kind of get this server up and running with our WSGI from our application. So this should be familiar. We've kind of just copied and pasted this in the past to handle our Django Docker image or Docker file. Okay, so this whole backend should be like if you have a Docker or sorry, a Django project open, yeah, I would expect everything under that main folder for your Django REST framework, everything under that would be pretty much copied and pasted into here. And then when we open our front end, we look, this is the same file structure we're used to with our React projects, right? We've got our index.html here, which is the source of our project, or the root of our project. And then everything's handled under this source. We have our app.jsx. I mean, this is your React application right here. Okay, public source, and then all the accessory files as well. So backend and front end should look pretty similar to what you've been working in at this point. Now, web server is something different. When we take a look at this Docker file, first off, there's a whole bunch of stuff. Don't get overwhelmed. Let's go down to the bottom and look here. This is basically when I said we were going to, oh my gosh, do I have stuff popping up down there for Steam? My friends are playing games. So this is what I was saying, where Nginx expects two things from us. It expects a configuration file to handle these requests that it's going to be getting from the front end, and then it expects our static files that build our front end. So all we did literally to write this image is we've, established our base image that we're starting off of, which is the Nginx server. We are copying that configuration file, which you can just, it's going to look the same pretty much every time. We'll talk about if there are differences where we need to make the differences, but it's pretty much going to look like this most of the time. And you'll structure it similarly. But we copy that default file, the default configuration, into this location in our Nginx image. And then we copy, this says from builder, front end dist. So a lot of this up here is basically doing the npm run build for us. And you can read the notes, like you can skip this whole part and just run npm run build in your terminal and then copy that output manually. So we can run npm run build right now, create a dist folder underneath this front end, and then just copy from the front end dist folder into this location. But this whole section above, see, it calls you a barbarian if you do that. Let's automate it instead of running these commands in our terminal. So this whole top part is basically just automating that npm run build command and making that dist folder for you. So it starts with node because npm is a Node.js command, right? So we need node as our base image to be able to handle using npm. So we call this from that image, and we're calling it as builder. If we say something as, what is this called?
An alias.
Yep, it's an alias. So we kind of saw that when we were doing our SQL commands, right? We use a little alias afterwards a lot of times to make it easier to refer back to. But we're using this as builder. We're saying our work directory is this front end. That's what we're pointing to. Now, this one is kind of interesting. This allows you to pass in environment variables, and this is going to be important when we're putting everything together. For local development, our URL for all of this is on the front end. When you're working in React and you're making requests, you're usually pointing towards your local host, right? When you try to do a request to your API or a fetch from your API, you're usually targeting localhost port 8000 or whatever to get that information back from your backend, correct? So when we run it locally, it's automatically going to plug this and it's going to use localhost as your URLs. And let's see if we could see in here. Where do we do a fetch? Okay. So this React app is getting a little dynamic in what you can provide it. So most of the time you're going to have a fetch from a hard-coded URL, right? You're going to identify that local host location up somewhere. Either you'll have it separately or you'll just do it directly in your fetch. But here we're taking an environment variable and setting our base URL to that environment variable and then fetching from that base URL. So it makes it so we can kind of change this up. This is something you'll see while you're on the job because very rarely will you ever have like your IPs will change a lot if you're using VMs. And then if you have a load balancer, that might be a little more static, but a lot of times you're not going to have a URL for your endpoints stay the same indefinitely. Sometimes it'll change and update or get altered. Um, so we don't really like to hard code where that API lives because it could change. And that's why we set it up as like an environment variable that we could pull from like a config file or we could pass in as an argument. This may be a little overwhelming right now, and that's okay. Go ahead and leave your URL hard coded at this point. So then if we do that, when we come back to this Docker file, we don't even have to have these lines then. If you've got hard coded URLs in there, you don't need to pass in a base URL. Okay. So this is just if you want to make it a little fancier, a little more dynamic, and where you're pointing to your endpoints. And we'll look at how this hooks up to the back end after we go through all these different points of our Docker files and our Docker Compose. So right now, let's pretend you have it hard-coded. Don't even worry about this, because all you want to do is build that dist folder, right? To get those 3 static files from your React app and then put it in your web server image. So we can just target this front end directory, and we're going to go to the package JSON, which in here we can see has a whole bunch of key value pairs. This is our scripts. So again, we call that build. That makes the dist folder. So we go to that location, copy that. We have to copy that into our image because it doesn't have any idea about how to do an npm run build. We need to copy that into the image. And then we could do an npm install, and then we copy our whole front end into there and then run a build. So again, this is automating, just coming to the command line, and let's see, let's go into front end, and let's make sure we have npm install. Now we can see our node modules, so we're good. We've got npm install going, and then we can just npm run build. And when we do npm run build, we get our dist folder. This is what we're targeting here. So since I ran this in my terminal, I don't need any of this anymore. We have our dist folder, so we can go ahead and copy from, let's see, this would be in here. So we're going to go back out to our front end folder, target that dist folder. We're going to copy all these files, which includes our HTML, our JavaScript, our CSS. We're going to put those in that Nginx location. Okay. Any questions so far on how this is basically your React Docker file, but we do it separately because it's kind of an in-between as well as the React app, because we need to have both this default configuration file and we need to copy over our front end files into our Nginx location. Any questions on this part? Okay, so backend pretty much stays the same in how you're used to making your Docker files. And again, you can refer back to, where was it? It was our last week in Django on how we set up that backend Docker file. So it's pretty much going to stay the same as that. Okay. Let's come back here. All right, so backend will stay the same. Front end, we make this little web server that has a configuration file and copies our React files into Nginx. Okay, so once you have those, we need to make our Docker compose. Let's see. Which we're doing, let's see, right here. We have two. So we have a dev and a prod, because this whole repo here is a bit fancier than how we've been working. Like we saw, it has like these arguments for like base URLs we can use. I'm gonna get these back up because this whole image runs as is. So I'm not gonna take these things out right now. But it uses like arguments you can pass in, which we saw in our front end, in our app. It was the app.js. No, it wasn't. It was in a component. So in these components, instead of going directly to a static URL, it's taking in that environment variable we're passing in. But then also in the back end, there is a lot of fancy stuff in here too. In our settings, if we see, we have like this base directory thing. I think this is different. No, that's probably not different, but the secret key. So instead of having our secret key hard-coded into our Django application, now we have an os get env, which is like get this environment variable called secret key. I also have like a debug, true if this environment variable debug is true. As we scroll down, we could see for our database, like it has get this environment variable database name. Otherwise, you use wines. So this is like a backup, this second part in here. But this first portion lets us pass in environment variables to change and plug in this database. So this application is expecting a lot of things to be passed in by the user when setting up these images. So we have two separate Docker composes. They look sort of similar, but they're a little different, and we'll look at these. When working locally, you'll use this Docker compose dev. So this is where we're throwing everything together like we saw. I'm clicking around like we saw here. in this Docker Compose file for our backend. This has API, database, and then once we learned about Nginx, we also added the Nginx in there. So this Docker file will, or Docker Compose file will look similarly. We have our API, which is our backend, a lot of environment variables here. And then we have our Nginx, and then we have our database. Now, if we compare, let's see, it should pretty much be very similar, identical, except for these database names and Postgres users and all that. We don't explicitly write in, you know, this is Postgres, and here's this one doesn't even have the, let's see, it has the database up there, then the user, then the password. But these are expecting values to be passed in for these. These are expecting variables or parameters to be passed in when we run our Docker Compose. We can definitely take these out and hard code it. We can say what the database name is. We can say what the user and password is. We can do all that, hard code it, but it's not good practice. And that's why we have this example on how to obscure it a little so that people can't just pull up your Docker file and see all of the sensitive information to access your resources. So you can certainly just hard code it if this is a little bit of a stretch right now for you, but it's better to leave these as parameters you will pass in when running your Docker Compose command. So this one will build the images locally. Okay, and it's looking, we can see the API is looking at that backend Docker file, and it's using port 8000. And this depends on our database. Our database is using the Postgres image and just building itself that way. And our Nginx web server, which has our front end, is looking at that web server Docker file, which we know is copying over this and our React static files. And that one's using port 80. So now how we can run this, and the README tells you how you can run this, is by calling this script right here, run compose dev. When we run compose dev, this is set up to plug in those environment variables that we're passing in to that Docker Compose file. And then we are going to Docker Compose that specific YAML file, the Docker Compose dev. Here we do hard code in because we should be, basically you would keep these files locally, you would not pass them to GitHub. But for dev, it doesn't really matter. Usually you can share dev stuff and it doesn't matter. So this one could be passed in. When we look at the prod, we'll see a little bit more restriction. And let's see. So, okay, let's look at this run compose file. This is a script. So you don't have to use this script. You could do all of these commands in your terminal, and it would do the same exact thing as the script is doing. But the script is putting these commands together so that all we have to do is run this. And because we've got our Docker Compose dev file relying on environment variables to be passed in, it makes it easier to go ahead and put it in a script and just export those environment variables. So it even says here, these are consumed by the Docker Compose file. So secret key can be anything, right? It's usually just a string of random things. That's what goes in your Django settings.py file. That can be whatever you want it to be. Debug, when we're doing dev work, we should probably put debug equals true so that we have some more options with our application when we're debugging. And then of course our Postgres database. This one is a wines application. So the wine database and Postgres for our user password. Once we've identified those variables, we run Docker compose using that YAML file up and build. So this is similar to what we've ran in the past in our terminal. Now, the difference is this also, and I think we had this maybe in our Django module. I can't remember if we did this as well. But when we put it in a script, remember we had to exec into our image and we had to make migrations and migrate. So in our script, we do this sleep 10. And that is, as it says, to make sure that everything gets up and running, like our Postgres database is up and running before we try to make these migrations. Because if Postgres isn't running and ready, when we try to make migrations, it's still be like, oh, I don't have a database ready to go. So we sleep for 10, which just pauses the script from running. So the script's going to run top down, top to bottom. So it's going to do this stuff first. It's going to build our Docker compose, our Docker images, and containerize them. And then it's going to stop for 10 seconds. After 10 seconds, it's going to exec into that container and then make migrations. I feel like we did that before in the Django module, but I can't quite remember. No harm in revisiting. And this, what you exec into, we're able to write this in here instead of like checking, the image name or the container name, because a container, let's see, I wrote this down. Usually it is, let's see, where is it at? Thought I wrote this down. Maybe I wrote it in a different lecture. We did do this before. But this is going to be, this first part here is the name of, oh, which probably won't run on this one right now. But it's the name of your directory that this is all under usually. So this is called Docker Compose app. But if you have this main directory something else, named something else, you'd replace this Docker Compose app with whatever your overall directory is called. API-1, so API is the name of, let's see, where do we find this again? Is it in the dev? I wish I could find why I looked this up and wrote this down before. Let me look real fast. Django. Oh, that's the wrong class. That's why. Dockerized API. Nope. It's React app. My goodness. Maybe I'll have to find it again here. Wow. Shame on me for not having this up and ready to go. We were looking at the run compose dev. I think it's usually always just called API and then -1. This is going to be the instance number. So if you have multiple containers running, this number will change, but typically it's always going to be the first one you make, unless if you have a ton running. So if your run compose dev doesn't work, I would check and make sure that I would do a Docker PS -A and see what the name is of the image it tried, or the Docker image it tried making or container. But theoretically, if y'all copied this down as is, this whole application should be ready to run just using this run compose dev. This run compose dev is going to pass in all those environment variables. It's going to use this dev YAML file where we do our Docker compose and spin it up locally. So that means just on our computer here. Now we also have a stop compose dev, which does the Docker compose down. The run compose prod now. This is a little different. So we can still see, so we have a Docker Hub username up here. Obviously replace it with what your Docker Hub is. We still have our environment variables. But this time they have like placeholder about like that's the $1, 2, 3, 4. These indicate that they're going to be command line arguments. And we'll look at what that means in a second. But these are not hard coded into this script like our dev one was. These are going to be passed in when we call the run compose prod script. And this one kind of does the same thing as dev, where it does Docker compose, Docker compose build, Docker compose up, and then it also sleeps and makes migrations and migrates. But let's look at what this is here, why we're having this Docker Hub account. So the goal for our prod deployment is to deploy this in our EC2 instance, right? We can copy over all the files and run them in our EC2 instance, but ideally you should be making sure that your local version works, and then you should be building these images and pushing them to Docker Hub. Okay, so that's where this script comes in. So before we do our run compose prod, we want to build these images that you made sure ran locally and put them on your Docker Hub. Because then as long as they're on your Docker Hub, anybody can pull those images down and run them, and they will work. So these are doing our Docker builds. There's a lot of things going on in here. It's identifying which platform we're using. It's taking a base URL as an argument, and then it's building this image name as well as a version number. This is going to be a lot, but hang with me here. And then this is also taking the web server file. So this is going to be the web server, right? This is building our web server image. It's allowing you to pass in, we can see these are command line variables again that it's expecting, or command line variables, arguments. So when we run this file, it's expecting us also to pass in a URL and a version number. Sorry, I'm on call too, so if I keep looking down at my phone, that's why. So it will build this web server image first and push it up to your Docker Hub. Your Docker Hub. You will replace with yours. The second part builds and pushes your API, which is the Django REST Framework Postgres database. So this second part is going to build using this platform, using this name, which is going to be your Docker Hub username / whatever you want to name it, and the version number. It's going to be using this Docker file and the backend, and it's going to push it up to your Docker Hub as well. So this file, once you have run your Docker compose dev and you can tell that everything's working locally, you know, you do your run compose dev, which calls that Docker compose dev file. Once you do this part, everything's working locally. Next step is to build and push those images to Docker Hub. Because if they're working locally, push them to Docker Hub and they will work whenever anybody pulls them. So this last one, this Docker compose prod, when we look here, it says image, and then it points to your Docker Hub username and the name of what we just built and pushed up to Docker Hub. So essentially, this is, instead of pulling from these directories, which when we go back to dev, we could see we build it using this directory, you know, build it using this directory in Docker file. We don't do that in prod. We just pull an image. We say build it using this image. that is out there. So for our Django REST framework, it's going to pull this backend image that we pushed up to Docker Hub. And then for our Nginx, our web server, it's going to pull this image that we already made for our web server and React front end. Now the database, this still just pulls Postgres image. We've been using Postgres image from the beginning. It's always using an image to make our database. But now, instead of using local directories and files, we are using an image for the other two components as well. Are we following here? Do we have any questions so far? If you're writing down a list, I'd say number 1, run compose dev and make sure this works locally, which we will be running through the steps in order here too. And we're going to run into some issues, which we will work through together. So number 1, we'll run compose dev. Make sure that this dev Docker compose is working locally. Number 2, once it is running, we will build and push images to our Docker Hub. Number 3, we will run compose prod, which will look at our Docker Hub. This run compose prod YAML looks at our Docker Hub and pulls those images and then runs them. So this run compose prod, if you run it locally, it will act kind of the same as run compose dev. It's just pulling from a different area. It's pulling your images from Docker Hub. But the goal is to copy this script over, this script and this, run compose prod YAML file. We want to copy those into our EC2 instance. Because if we can just pull those images down and run them with this script and this Docker Compose file, why can't I just put that script and Docker Compose file in my EC2 instance and run them there? And that is the goal. So before we run compose prod, actually, we will set up an EC2 instance. And this part, let's see. So this part is in the README, how to use this. So it kind of walks through, again, how those 3 services work. And it even tells you, like, some of these files might not work. We might have to do a chmod command to make sure we can run the scripts, but run compose dev uses the Docker compose file dev, starts everything up locally. Once it's done, build and push images. And that's for development. Now for production, you create an EC2 instance. After you create an EC2 instance, you make sure you've run this build and push images script and then pass in, usually when you see these, like, what are those called? The triangle brackets. I forget what they're actually called. This means something you pass in. So when you say my EC2 IP address, that means put the IP address of the EC2 instance here. There's no quotes or anything around it. It's just straight up put that in, and then this expects also a version number. So that build and push images script expects the EC2 IP address and the version number. Once you get your EC2 instance up and you've run your images, build and push images, what does build and push images do again? I know we've been walking through a lot of stuff, but can anybody remember what build and push images script does for us? In a few words.
So it'll build your image and push it to your Docker Hub?
Yes, correct. So build and push images literally just builds our images and pushes them to Docker Hub. So we set up an EC2 instance. We made sure that our images are built and pushed to Docker Hub. And then now we need to fix up our EC2 instance to be able to handle Docker files and Docker Compose and all that. So this setup EC2 script that we have in our directory here, setup EC2 script, this handles that for you in your EC2 instance. But if we remember in the past, when working with the EC2 instances, we have to copy things into it. Like, nothing exists in your EC2 instance. You have to copy files into it. So this command copies over. This is going to be whatever your PEM file is that you get from your EC2 instance. This command copies over the setup script, the run compose prod script, the docker compose prod script, and places them in you will replace with whatever your EC2 instance is. And this should be provided to you on your EC2 instance panel, your command page or whatever. You should have a sample copy command. And if you don't, you definitely have the exec into command, which you can then grab your EC2 information from. So for production, we create our instance, we build and push our images to our Docker Hub, we copy all these files over, and then once we've copied them over, we can literally just run setup EC2 script, which will set up all of our Docker stuff in our EC2 instance, and then run compose prod with our appropriate arguments, which will then set up our Docker container with all those images running with the appropriate arguments in our EC2 instance. Any questions on the life cycle of how we're going to do our compose here, our Docker compose? Oops. Now again, this might be a little more complicated than what you're hoping. You don't have to do all of these scripts if you don't want to. The important part to take away is that your backend Docker file is going to stay the same, and your Docker Compose really is going to stay similar to what you've done in the past, which you can use this Django one to kind of look back to. Because this has all the different components, right? And it has our API, our Nginx, and our database. This is still looking at a web server Docker file. So we've done this in the past. The only difference is our web server Docker file now, instead of just copying the default configuration, we have to also copy our React files. Okay, so if you're more comfortable doing it like just you typing out all the commands in the command line instead of using scripts, go ahead and do that. That's fine, and leave everything as is. This one is super fancy with all these variables we pass in, these URLs and all the other stuff it's expecting. We can see our run compose prod expects us to pass in 6 different command line arguments when we're calling this script. So it's a little more complicated. And if you have not set up your front end and back end to be dynamic like this, i.e. if you have not done something like this where you get your environment variables, don't do these scripts as they are. Just hard code everything. You won't do that in real life, so it's good to kind of get used to seeing where these differences are. But there's nothing wrong with starting out slow and building on that. This, you might have to play around in the front end and back end to see where exactly all these environment variables are getting pulled into each of these applications. And you'll see it kind of like this. React uses this import meta environment. In your, let's see, in your Django project, it uses like an os.getenv. So secret key, debug, and then we saw in the front end, where was it? Secret key, debug, and Vite base environment URL. These are all environment variables that are being passed in. And when we look at our run compose prod, secret key, debug, this one doesn't have the environment the URL one because I think that's in our Docker file here. So this one, this environment variable for the base URL is specified in the web server Docker file here. So this one, when you make it locally, it's just going to pass this argument in. However, if you give it a URL, which you do in, let's see, your build and push images, you have the base URL argument being passed in for your web server Docker file. Okay, are we super confused yet? If you don't want to do all these arguments being passed in the command line, take out everything up here. You don't need that. Just run your own npm run dev and everything in the command line. And this is your Docker file for the web server. But for now, we are going to go through how to use this and run this and see how it goes. And after we're done with this, I can stop recording and we can kind of go through how you can copy and paste into these different folders to just use this as well. But that can be like a stretch thing if y'all want. Okay, so let's try this. Let me first, I'm gonna get rid of these changes because I did the npm run build in the command line. So remember that I'd created, let's delete these two. Created a dist folder and a node modules folder. I don't want that. I want to start from like scratch. So like I didn't do any commands and it's original, untouched. So first thing we need to do is run compose dev to make sure that this runs locally. So this, we'll see if this works. Let me clear my terminal first. Everybody's computer will work differently with this too. And we've seen this in the past. So let's make sure we're in the right place to call that script. And I am obviously not. I'm in the front end folder. So let's get back up. Now we're at the base or at the root. We have our run compose dev file right there. When it's green, that means you can run that script. It's good to go. If it's like white or a different color, you may have to do like the README says. You may have to run this chmod command to change the permissions on the script. The 755 lets you execute scripts. Okay, so let's just do run compose dev. This is how I call this script. I just say, hey, do this file in this directory. Like I call it. So when I do that, I get an error. It says in this script, line 12, Docker compose command not found. Like what the heck? Let's take a look back at some of what we did in the past here for our Docker compose. Let's just make sure everything looks like it should. Okay, well, that one says I can do docker-compose up. So I feel like this should be right, but let's go ahead and Google it as well. So I'm getting docker-compose command not found. Can't do the Docker compose executable. Let's see. This is AI, so it may not be helpful. So we can do this one. It has Docker space compose. So this looks like it's the newer syntax for the Docker command line plugin, whereas docker-compose is for the standalone tool. So I'm wondering, I probably have then maybe I'll try this Docker space compose instead of dash. Yours might work as is, or it might complain like this because it depends on what you have. If you have the standalone tool or the plugin. So I'm just gonna try this Docker compose. Okay, let's see if that works. So let's run this again. Oh, so it's doing something. So I found it now. Obviously that command works for my machine, might not work for yours, but we can also troubleshoot that as well. So we have some issues. First issue, we get an error here. What step is this? Let's scroll back up and kind of work through here. So we're doing my Docker compose, my run compose dev. So let's walk through this. Started by pulling all the images, right? Because that's what it does. And then we can see it's doing some loading stuff. Okay, 1 of 5. So it looks like it did the build for my API. It's going through, oh, this looks familiar, right? This looks like what's in my API Docker file. Okay, so we see it did set the work directory. That worked okay, and it did this copy requirements.txt into there. But then we get an error on 4 out of 5, which is the run pip install requirements.txt command. So it didn't like this. We get an error here. Let's see why we got an error. All this is nice and blue. That looks good. It's also copying over. So it continued on, even though it got an error, it still cached all the rest of the steps that it was able to do. So that's nice, but let's look at this. This is the step that run pip install requirements.txt. So most of it's looking good, except, oh, error, error. So anytime you get an issue, error is gonna be what you're looking for. That stands out, tells you what went wrong. Most of the time warnings are fine and we'll keep going. They're just gonna let you know, something might be wrong, but error is a hard stop. This will stop stuff. So could not find a version that satisfies the requirement install 1.3.5. Okay, let's look at my requirements.txt file. I do have an install 1.3.5. I don't know what that is. I'm just going to take it out right now and we'll see if things work. You can also look at some of your current Django REST framework projects and see what your requirements file looks like that you did with a pip freeze. Remember, you pip freeze into requirements.txt. It makes that. Just make sure that you have the Gunicorn in there because that's important for your Docker file. That's our web server, or not our web server, that's our backend server handling backend requests. But let's try this. I don't think I need it install 1.3.5. I don't know if I do. I don't think I do. We'll see if it works without it. Okay, let's try again. Run compose dev. Okay, we got to the part that I had issues with last time. Let's see what it does. Okay, we're getting some warnings, but that's fine. It's building. Oh, okay, we got the Docker container started. Look, we have a volume too, because we're saving our Postgres data in volumes. And uh-oh. Okay, so let's take a look at that. But we've got the containers built and started. So we're almost there. Our run compose dev is almost working. We managed to do our Docker compose and it built them and they started. And then it was hanging out, so it was probably on that sleep. And then it had an issue running this response from a no such container. Docker compose app API -1. Okay, so it says I don't have, this is not my container. Well, what the heck? What is my container? Oh, if we look here, the container is Docker compose app 2. And that one says database. So, okay, that's right. Now I remember these suffixes, I guess, I don't know. These things that append on to the end of your directory are what you have called it in your Docker compose file. So we have API, Nginx, and database. When we want to migrate, make migrations and migrate, what image are we trying to do that in? Or what container? If I want to make migrations and migrate.
Two.
You said 2?
Yeah, two. You're in Docker Compose 2, right?
Okay, yep. So I'm in Docker Compose app 2, but out of these 3 services, the API, Nginx, and database, where do I want to run my migrations?
Oh, API.
Correct. We want to run those migrations in the API service. So this first part's the name of your directory that you're working in, usually, typically. So mine is called Docker Compose App 2. And then API is what I want to run them in, API-1. So let's go back to my run compose dev. And we saw that, okay, I have Docker Compose app, API-1. But mine is called app 2. So this would be where you change your name in the beginning here to match whatever your directory is called. But it's typically going to be API-1. Again, you can see that there. If you, oops, -1. If you, oh, I took out the whole thing. If you don't still have this up on your terminal, then of course you could do Docker PS. It might still be running. Yeah, you could do Docker PS and see the names of your containers that are running. So you can either look here or you can do Docker PS and grab the one you're trying to target and exec into and replace it in this run compose dev script. Okay, so I think we'll be okay. These are actually running. So I've created them and ran them and they are running. Do I need to run this whole script again? What do we think? Art, I see you shaking your head no. And I believe you are right. Why do you think we don't need to run the whole script again?
Because you already have some of the containers up.
Yep, so we've already done this Docker Compose and built the containers and they're running. The only thing that failed was this part, the make migrations and migrate. So if I ran this whole script again, it would probably create another one maybe or something. It might get weird. It would get weird. You can stop these and clean and retry again, but I'm just gonna copy these last 2 commands. So let's exec into the container that's running there. No changes detected. All right. And then let's go ahead and exec in and migrate. All right, looks good. That's what we like to see, right? All migrations have been applied. We can see our admin, our auth sessions, and the wine API. This is what I look for the most. I don't know about y'all, but I like to see that my app that I made in my doc or my backend in my Django REST framework, I like to make sure that the app got applied as well. So my wine API migrations were applied. Okay, so now if we Docker PS, we can see everything's up and running. It's been up. We've, execed into there and made migrations. So this should be good to visit. And where are we going? How do I see if this application is up and running? Some chats here too. Oh, just BRB. So if we build and run something locally, where is it going? And go to localhost, right? How do I know where to go on localhost? Like I can't just do localhost. I guess I can just do localhost. National network. I guess that works for us because default HTTP is going to go to port 80. And we have in our, let's see, in our default, we have listen on port 80. So that's where our application should be. And then our API portion of our application should be on port 8000. So we should be good here. And in our, let's see, Docker Compose dev, we've done our port mapping 80 to 80 and 8000 to 8000. So I guess just coming here is fine. because it's default where you go for HTTP. So we can see my application looks like it's up. We don't have anything in the database right now. I guess I can, let's create a wine. Wine name. I don't know, we'll just do red blend. $12, and it's gonna be a red, it's called red blend, and it is a red blend. Blend of all the reds. Okay. So now let's list, and we can see everything's working. Back end is accepting data from the front end and storing it in the database, and it's listing it on my front end page here, my all wines location. So the first part is done. I built it locally. Everything works locally when I did my images. And I didn't, with this one in particular, this run compose dev, this does not expect any environment variables to be passed in because we have hard coded everything that we made, like relying on an environment variable in our applications. You all probably don't have to pass in anything ever anywhere. You can just make your Docker files and your Docker compose to be hard coded, right? We don't have to pass in all these environment variables. You can just hard code them. That's fine. And your React page, you probably just have hard coded URLs that you're going to. I'm going to the wrong one. So you probably have this hard coded. That's fine for now. So don't worry about passing in environment variables and stuff. You can just build your Docker compose here and your exec into, and you can have your Docker compose file, just have the values plugged in, no accepting in command line arguments. Okay. But it worked for me because in mine, like since I do have environment variables being pulled in into my application, I just explicitly define those in my run compose dev file. So this is what's being passed into everything. It's Postgres database name, all that. All right, so application works locally. Check. Let's go ahead and close it, and let's do our stop compose dev. That's going to take down, let's see what it does. Stop compose dev literally just does this command. You know what? I'm also going to add a, what is it? Let's do clean. That's my command, you know, I wrote here locally in my shell path stuff, or shell script, I forget what it's called, where I added all those special commands to clean up. It's going to delete all of these. Now, this Docker compose down. When I made this, let's see, when we go to our Docker compose dev, we can see I have a volume for my database. What does the volume do again for our database? Do we remember? So the volume is going to have, it's going to allow your data to persist. So normally, if you don't have a volume, normally when you stop your image, your Docker image, all that data gets wiped. It's gone. But we want this stuff to stay because what if we need to do maintenance or we have something else we need to do on the website? We want to take it down for an hour or two and then put it back up. We want all the data to still be there. So the volume keeps that data so that we can stop and bring down our image and the data will still be there. So when we do our stop compose or Docker compose down, this is going to leave that data in your database. We can add a flag in here to also bring down the volume if you want. So you can Google, in case you start getting weirdness with your data in your database, sometimes it's helpful to just bring the volume down and start from scratch. So you can, I think it's just a -v in there. I forget, I'd have to look up the command. But let's do this. And I think, let's try the Docker dash compose, but I'm pretty sure he's gonna yell at me again because I needed to do the Docker space compose. So this is going to be the stop compose dev. Command not found. Yep. Okay, so I'm gonna have to space it out. Wonder if my clean will work. We'll see. It's gonna take a minute to get down your API. No, clean not found. That's fine. We'll take it out. So let's see PS-A. Okay, nothing's there. They're all gone. The container's gone. I think that's probably based on how we, okay. This -D, I think, brings down the whole Docker container and makes it go away after you're done when you bring it down. And runs it without, let's see, eating up your command line. I'll have to see which one. One of those makes it so that when you bring it down, the container is deleted too. Okay, let's look at our Docker images. Oh, Docker image. Images, Docker image. I had two in there, didn't I? Yep. Okay, so these images still exist. I'm gonna go ahead and just clean them out. I like to start from scratch for everything. You can leave them on, that's fine, but sometimes it might get a little weird when you're doing these next steps if you leave them up. Because next, okay, we ran it locally, we made sure that the images worked locally. We built those images locally, right? The goal is now to make these images again and then push them to our Docker Hub. So once again, if you don't want to use this script and you just want to do it from the command line like you're used to, you can run compose dev, make those images, see what those change the names of these images, right? So we did that before with the Docker T thing, like the Docker build -T. This is where you change the name to the new image name, and it has to be your Docker Hub username / whatever you want it to be named. So you can do that individually for each of those. You can run each individual Docker build and then Docker push. But if you use this script, this build and push images, there's a few things we need to update. So first we need to make sure that our username is in here. This is my Docker Hub username, where it's gonna go. We see this script, this build and push images script expects a base URL to be passed in because let's see, so this gets built with an environment variable that sets the URL of the React app base URL. So once you know the IP address of your EC2 instance, that's what you pass in here. So you probably shouldn't do this part until you get your EC2 instance IP address. So set up your EC2 instance first, and then you can do this build push images. But we can do it now. We can do it now, but we'll just pass in like localhost for now or something. Because we'll be able to change it with this version number. So this is where this version is going to come into play. When I build and push these to Docker Hub, let's see, let's go to Docker Hub. I don't have it just saved. Sign in. Okay. So let's see, if we come to like my work in the past, let's see, group backend prod, and we come in here, we can see a whole bunch of different images with different version numbers. So every time I did a build and push and changed that version number, it built a new image with a new tag. So that's what this does, passing in this version, is it lets you build to the same name, because before we had to keep changing the name, right? If you had an image that existed with the same name before, you couldn't do another one with the same name. You had to change it. So now when we do this : version number, it lets us build with the same name over and over and over again. So I was able to keep making a group backend prod image and keep pushing and building the images or building and pushing the Docker Hub, but I would just change the version number. So let's start off. We're just going to do localhost for now because we're just going to run it on our local host. But once you set up an EC2 instance, you would build a new version number that takes in your EC2 instance URL instead. So let's read through the command. Let's see what we need to change here. We have Docker build. The platform we're going to leave as Linux because our EC2 instance is going to be in a Linux server, right? So let's leave it as Linux. This base URL will pass in my Docker Hub username. I've changed up there. I am gonna, let's see, do I have a web server prod? If I do, I'm gonna rename this. Web server prod, web server prod. Yeah, so let's do 2. Web server prod 2 for me. And then we're gonna use this web server Docker file to build this image. Then we're going to push our username web server prod 2 and the version to Docker Hub. Okay. Same thing down here. I'm sure I already have an API prod, so I'm just going to do 2. We're going to use that backend Docker file. Then we're going to push that API prod image to my Docker Hub. Okay, so now when I run this script, this should build those images that we've already successfully built locally, and then rename them to my Docker Hub username / whatever I want, plus a version number, and then push it up to Docker Hub. So am I still in the right spot? Yes, we are still here. We're gonna run or build and push images. So now this is how we do these command line arguments. I'm going to call this script, and then now I'm literally just gonna put down the values that these 2 arguments should be. So first one is base URL. I am going to just start off with localhost because I'm going to run this locally and that's fine. Once we get our EC2 instance up and running, you would put the IP address of your EC2 instance. So it'd be something like, I don't know, it would be what that IP is of your EC2 instance. So we're going to do localhost. And then if you remember when we did run control, or what is it? Was it run compose dev here? No, it's in the web server. I keep getting mixed up. So, no. Where did it was in backend. Oh, I'm getting confused now. I'm getting sleepy. It is here. I just didn't scroll up. Okay, so when we built this locally, it used this argument automatically, but now when I'm doing this build and push images, I'm passing in a variable. So we had it set as localhost for locally. I'm going to just pass in localhost for this environment variable now. So that's all I'm doing. So this build and push images, base URL is going to be localhost still for me. And then new version. Well, I start 1.0.0. Okay, that's your first version you are making. Let's go ahead and run this and see what it does. So it should run okay for the first bit because that is the build images command. And then once we've built those images and gave it that new name, we're going to push them to our Docker Hub. So it's gonna take a minute to work. See, we're on that step now in our backend Docker file that pip installs. And now we're pushing to the Docker Hub. And I should have the right username this time. And it looks like everything went well. We got pushed. We had 3 images that we had built and pushed. So let's go to my Docker Hub now, refresh and see if those images made it here. Hey, there they are. So we have, oh, that's from 7 to 8. We only have 2 now up on because 2 images go into 1 container on here. the database and the Django REST framework are both in the API. And then the Nginx is in the web server. So here are my two images I just built and pushed to Docker Hub. And when we look at them, they should have a 1.0.0 version number on it. Okay, almost to the end of official, and then we'll take a break, a good break, and then we'll figure out some other stuff to do for the day. But so now that I've built and pushed the images to Docker Hub, I would set up my EC2 instance, and then I would follow what this README tells me to do in the production. So we're going to create, because we've created an EC2 instance. Make sure that you run this again, this build and push images, but this time instead of localhost. So let's see, I should be able to. So I have those, these are the images I pushed up to Docker Hub. I should be able to run these two right now. So I should be able to do a Docker compose with the I should just Docker run. Docker run Joel / API prod 2. Unable to find it locally. I'd probably have to pull it and then redo it. Oh my gosh. Well, we could look into that later if we want to, but we should be able to just pull the image. Let's see, Docker pull Tiffany Joel. Maybe prod 2. Not found. Manifest unknown. Is it Docker build? That's what we're doing here. Docker compose build these images. No, that's from the YAML. Yeah, so you could figure out how to run them individually, but the point of Docker compose is that it's going to be running them all together in a nice way that it's supposed to be ran together. So that's why we're using this this setup here for Docker compose prod. But I could, let's see. I could just Docker run compose prod and pass in all this information right now. Obviously, when I change this. So this run compose prod, it Docker composes based off your Docker compose prod, which pulls those images from Docker Hub. So this is the nice way to do everything, to run it together. So you'd still make a Docker compose prod like this, but maybe you don't have all these environment variables, but maybe you do. So if I had my EC2 instance up and running, and let's see, let's go back to the README, and I built and pushed images. Now, instead of doing localhost and 1.0, I would probably do whatever the IP address is, so that whatever, and then and something else, and then I would give it like a 1.0.1. Oh, that's a bug fix. We'd do a 1.1.0 maybe, a new, let's see, a new feature. So I would probably run this command again like this. You know, I'd do the same script to build and push images, but using the EC2 instance IP address, and then increment your version. If you don't increment your version number, you will have problems. But once I ran that, then I would copy these files into my EC2 instance. Again, this information is pulled from your EC2 dashboard, and you would have a PEM file as well that is unique to you. And then once you're in your EC2 instance, like you exec in there after you've copied them in and exec in there, you can run setup EC2 instance and then run your run compose prod. When you run compose prod in your EC2 instance, this is kind of what it would look like. run compose prod now, and you go down the line. Secret key. Secret key can be whatever you want it to be. So secret key. Debug. We're going to put debug as false. And then Postgres database. That is going to be the name. Ours is called wines, right? We can kind of look at our run compose dev and see our Postgres database is called wines. That's what we named it. And then let's see, where's our run compose prod after Postgres database? Then it expects a user. So then our user is Postgres. Our password is Postgres, and then our version number, and this is going to be the version that you're pulling from Docker Hub. Okay, when we run compose prod, let's see, so our Docker compose prod, it's going to look for that Docker Hub username / whatever this is called. Mine's called 2. Make sure your run or Docker compose prod reflects what you're trying to pull. So mine are called backend prod 2 and web server prod 2. And then the version number. So when we came in here, oh, mine's called API prod 2, actually. So let me change that even more. And version number 1.0.0. So this is called API prod 2 1.0.0. These are the images in your Docker Hub that you are pulling. Okay, so make sure these images, the names match, and you pass in the correct version number in the command line if you're using these passed in variables. Okay, so that should be it, right? I have secret key, I made it secret key, whatever, make it some numbers, whatever. Debug, I put false. The database is wines. The user is Postgres, password is Postgres, and the version number that I'm pulling from my Docker Hub is 1.0.0. I'll look back on dev and make sure that's wines, Postgres. Okay, which we did that in our, not there, we did that in our Docker Compose. No, where did we do that? We did it in settings, right? In our backend. That's where you make your database. Anyways, so building and pushing images, or sorry, running your prod deployment. You can run compose prod in your EC2 instance and pass in this information. When I do this now, run compose prod, oh, of course mine doesn't work because I don't have Docker-compose. Okay. This is going to be not EC2 user. This is going to be the name of my thing still, because I'm doing it locally still. This only works if you're using your EC2 instance. Run compose prod EC2 user. Yeah, it's going to be EC2 user when you're in your EC2 instance, but I'm doing this locally still, so it's going to kind of be similar to my dev. I'm going to exec into these. I think it's going to be named something different though, so let's just do that later. Let's run it and see what it's named, and then we'll fix these lines here for the make migrations and migrate. But this one is finding that Docker Compose 2 app or app 2 or whatever. It's pulling those images, and then let's see, so it's not called EC2 user API, it's called Docker Compose app here, because I'm still local. If I was in my EC2 instance, this is what it would be called. So I could change these to the local, but I'm not going to because we're pretending that we're doing this in our EC2 instance. And this would work kind of the same way your run compose dev does, where it's building and running these images. but prod is pulling from a Docker Hub image instead. Docker Hub image. Okay. I am going to either stop or take a break now, for everybody's sake. Are there any immediate questions that are sticking out to you? If we want to do this without all of these environment variables, you can still use these scripts, just take out all the environment variables. But then that means make sure that everything's hard coded in your code. Take out anything that says, let's see, I would still keep up this new version number because that's literally only going to be used here. So if you take out that base URL, just change this to 1. And then we could take out this whole thing because you wouldn't be doing that. It would be hard coded, right? This is going to be the hardest part of your projects is deploying to your EC2 instance. Okay, let me stop recording and we'll kind of discuss what we're going to do today. Stop sharing, stop recording.